let's spend a few minutes thinking about how conservation biology might work. We talked about habitat loss. If we have a habitat that is lost because of changes in human influences, changes in the environment, changes in climate, so if we have increased earthquakes, increased volcanoes, increased number of highways through a given ecosystem, we end up fragmenting populations or breaking them up. And this habitat loss means that we're going to actually split and isolate particular populations. So if you split up a population and you isolate them into particular areas, this is something we've referred to previously as bottlenecking, right? A population. And if you do that, you can actually lead this population to extinction, because maybe they no longer have the resources needed to actually maintain high levels of reproduction and survival. So when we look at fragmentation problems, they're not just in urban areas. We actually have looked at fragmentation patterns. This is actually Mount Hood National Forest in the western U.S. Huge fragmentation patterns to forests, meaning that some of the owl species and others are not able to maintain their ranges for hunting. They're very territorial, so if you decrease their range size or their area that they're able to hunt, they can't hunt as successfully. They may not have the same number of offspring because all of a sudden they don't have the food available to them. So there's been a lot of work to stop that. We better understand now that we have to maintain areas in a whole so that animals can survive as they need to, behave as they need to in those particular areas. There have been some very high-profile success stories associated with this red-cockaded woodpecker in particular, looking at essentially gone from near extinction, very few individuals, to essentially sustainable populations now, naturally sustainable populations, and it's all about maintaining habitats. So in the past, we focused on one species, like that woodpecker. But now what we're actually looking at is we have to focus on biodiversity. Not just one species, but how many different species are in a given area. We have to maintain this high diversity for the benefit of all of the species in that particular region. Plants, bugs, animals, birds, I don't care what you want to look at. High levels of biodiversity allow us to better maintain everyone in that space. And so landscape ecology has become a huge, huge market. So looking for individuals who are very adept and very educated on changes in different types of ecosystems and those dynamics of those ecosystems. How do they change? How do they naturally change versus what are we doing to them? And thinking about the fact that simply increasing the edges. So you see here, there are spaces where these trees are missing. And you might think, well, who cares? Right? There's still lots of trees. But the problem is animals won't come out of that edge. They want to be protected in that space. And so now instead of being able to run back and forth across the bottom here, if they want to get from one side to the other, they're actually going to traverse this entire way around, meaning that we have huge changes in the dynamics of those populations, territories of those populations. I mean, we're talking several hundred acres in this photo, right? So huge numbers that we have to deal with. So instead of breaking things up as we often have in the past, we now look at something known as movement corridors. And you are going to make fun of this, okay? Go ahead, make fun of it. This is an animal bridge in Banff National Park in Canada. And it literally is road through the middle. The animals are supposed to move around over the top here. Do they? Sometimes. They didn't all get the memo, but it at least allows a passageway where normally if they were trying to run across this highway, this would be Frogger in action, right? They're all dead. But when we look at giving these corridors or bridges, they actually are helping in some cases, with different populations that need to move back and forth between water or food supplies. So when we look at these biodiversity kinds of ideas now, instead of focusing on one species, they've identified what we call hotspots. So these are areas where they have a high number of threatened or endangered species. So these are spaces that need to be high on our list of priorities for maintaining, and a high number of what we call endemic species. So these are the native species to an area, right? And they may only be found in that particular region. And so when we look at this, we see here's some of the hotspots for us, and you notice where they are. Many of them are along the equator, right? And many of them are coastal. We've done a very, very bad job as humans of maintaining good terrestrial coastal interactions. And so what we've ended up with is a lot of pollution on the coasts, which not only affects the land of the coast, but also the oceans and seas. So a lot of these organisms that we talk about are very dependent on both the land and water in these given spaces. So if we look at things like monarch butterflies, used to be in the millions in their migrations and are down significantly in recent years because they have huge migration distances from Canada down through Mexico into South America. And they're dependent on particular plant species, things like milkweed, to eat along the way, and particularly in their given spaces. And they're very dependent on wetland plants, and we've lost a lot of our wetlands over the years. So their species is very, very much endangered. Sea turtles, the problem is, again, migratory. So they're not spending their entire lives in one area. So protecting their biodiversity, protecting those species is very difficult. Let's look at this. So this is the Pacific migration route for leatherback sea turtles. They've tagged particular sea turtles. How do you set up a conservation effort that goes from Australia to Washington State? How do you do that, right? How do you protect the entire Pacific Ocean? It's a difficult one to think about, right? So we've got to keep in mind that many areas now are difficult to maintain and coordinate in areas that we would really want to. And when we look at these spaces, about 7% of the world's land is now in some sort of form of reserve, particularly coastal areas. So national park kind of thing to help protect these different species. And so when we look at these zoned reserves, we're really looking at the ability to increase sustainable development. Everyone wants their house on the coast. Well, how can we do that but use it to increase awareness of the problems associated with biodiversity? So we've got to find some way to kind of interact. They've done a very nice job of this actually in Costa Rica, thinking about zoned reserves. So they essentially have these national park lands, and they say, you can't build here. Sorry, no go. Okay. And then they have these buffer zones around them. So not only do they have these clumps, like we said, fragmentation is bad, edges are bad. So they've developed these parklands, but then put buffer zones around them that you're not allowed to develop there. Sorry, we'll give you some coastal space. And you see in the brown, the coastal space where you could build if you're looking to build your dream home in Costa Rica. But you're not going to touch the green and yellow spaces because we have to maintain those areas for not only endemic species, but also migratory species. Closer to home, we've looked at huge efforts to maintain a 3,200 kilometer wildlife corridor from Yellowstone to the Yukon Conservation. And the big thing here is essentially making a string of parks and reserves that go from Alaska across Canada into northern Wyoming. And this focus started primarily because of wolf populations and the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone that happened roughly 20 years ago. And this reintroduction meant that we still had to have pack mentality. We still had to have spaces for these organisms to roam just because you reintroduce a wolf into Yellowstone doesn't mean that when it gets to the border of Yellowstone, it's going to stop walking, right? Okay. So the big problem with this is this literally is set up. Now here's our Yukon region, and essentially set up these strings of parks. You're not allowed to shoot a wolf within this area. So for ranchers, wolves tend to attack sheep, right? They're easy prey. So the problem is ranchers started shooting the wolves, and what researchers and conservationists and park rangers had to go in and explain, look, the wolves are maintaining the biodiversity that is supposed to be here. The deer and the elk are dying because there's not enough food. Why are they dying? Because there's not enough food? Because there's too many of them. The wolves had been eliminated from the area. Wolves are the natural predator of these animals. If we bring these back, we're going to control deer populations and elk populations and better maintain the balance that should be in this area. And so it really is coming back to basics. What is the basic ecological principle to maintain an ecosystem? You got to have predators, you got to have prey, you got to have a food source, you got to have a water source, you got to have habitat. Okay, so really taking all of this into consideration to think about how bioremediations, native vegetations, planting things that really make a difference to these local areas, and thinking about how that impact might affect all of those populations in a given area. And so things very basic like the Kissimmee River in Florida, and thinking about how for many years we've controlled its flow. We essentially said we want the river to run here because we want to build houses here, we want recreation here, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so they put in all these water control structures. Dams, basically, right? Back up the river, make it go where we want it to go. And unfortunately, rivers don't behave that way. A true natural river will be very meandering from side to side, and you see this. So they took out this water control feature, and the original path of the river that we forced it into followed my line here, but now you see where it has gone back. It's going to follow the path of least resistance, and with gravity, right? Water flows downhill, so to speak. So when we look at this process of removing these control structures, they did this and they've decreased flooding in the areas. This floodplain that you have here was constantly being flooded because the river was being forced to go where it didn't want to go. This is what it looks like for real. So this is where control structures had forced the water into, and now that control structure has been removed, you see it's gone back to this very natural meandering river. Now for some, they don't like this. They don't want the river going where it wants. They want to control it. Unfortunately, it will do what it wants eventually. So it's better to work with it than against it. The biosphere, our entire planet, is very complex. We know this, but we need to think about sensible decisions for conservation efforts. What's feasible for biodiversity in particular? What's going to increase that biodiversity? What's going to keep us on track? What's going to allow us to actually have sustainable development? I'm not saying that we need to stop building houses and so on, but I'm saying let's step back a minute and think about how it makes sense to do in a way that will not only be best for the surrounding ecosystems, but for us as we're trying to live amongst the wildlife.